see if my baby brain will work, eh? So I wanted to talk a little bit about policy. Policy is something that influences all aspects of our lives every day, and it's particularly important when you consider environmental limits and making sure that we keep well away from exceeding ecological thresholds that can endanger particular species or indeed our complete societal survival. New Zealand's natural capital is incredibly unique. It's globally unique. It's our value proposition to the world. It underpins our tourism industry. It underpins all of our major industries. In fact, it's quite hard to farm without ecological services. And it has incalculable value to the heritage of Māori and Pākehā alike. Unfortunately, it's facing significant threat. A lot of New Zealand, a lot of our environmental indicators are at or beyond safe limits. We've had a pretty incredible and rapid transformation of our landscapes, freshwater ecosystems and seascapes over the last just 1,000 years, a scale of transformation that in continental areas has taken tens of thousands of years. So we've done it well. And it's unsustainable and it's untenable. But the reality is, for at least the last 100 years, there's been an awful lot of law and policy that was meant to avoid that. There's been a lot of paper that should have gotten in the way. And I think when I think about New Zealand's environmental law and policy framework, I think of laudable intentions, lamentable outcomes. I think of an awful lot of paper, and I've read most of it, but the outcomes generally don't meet expectations. And there's a range of examples. There's a few on the next slide, and I'm sure all of you can probably think of an example of where there was a policy goal in place to protect a natural aspect that you're particularly passionate about, and it didn't quite cut the mustard. So the question is, why does law and policy fail? And there's always a gap. That's the nature of trying to get behaviour change in a population. There's a gap between the aspirations of any kind of law and policy and the outcomes on the ground. The reality is, in the environmental sector, it's less a gap than a chasm. And that's been recognised by environmental academics all over the world, that the shortfall is particularly significant when you're protecting that which has no voice. So what are some of the reasons? Well, think of the Maui's dolphin. One of the principal reasons why the Maui's dolphin is in trouble is disputed science and a failure to observe the precautionary principle. The precautionary principle says you need to be a little bit stricter on the vested interests that gain money from destroying the habitat of a species and from incidental catch of that species than you probably need to be just in case. And the reality is that that argument is very hard to have. Ambiguity tends to favour extraction. Maui's is just one example. On the subject of ambiguity, often to finalise a policy, you get ambiguity for the sake of consensus. You have a lot of different views at the table, and you're just trying to please everyone enough so they won't stop at getting over the line. And as a result, you have things like, you will balance economic and environmental interests. And I don't need to tell anybody in this room which one of those is the loudest. And regional councils' actions on nutrients are probably the best example. Regional councils and entities have been dominated by farmers, by rural landowners for as long as they've existed, and the result has been a genuine and enduring reluctance to put proper limits in place on agricultural transformation. The state of our freshwater ecosystems is testament to that. Another reason it fails is failing to keep pace with change. A lot of our law is quite old, and in the wildlife space, it's particularly old. The Wildlife Act 1953 is a lovely piece of legislation, probably from the time that it was promulgated, but it slips as time goes on, as societies change, as values change. The efficacy of the law changes unless you keep pace with that and you modify and you modernise it over time. Most wildlife legislation in New Zealand is out of date and requires urgent and large-scale review. A good example is the Native Plant Protection Act. The Native Plant Protection Act protects plants on private land, which is very important. For those of you that know about threatened plants, you'll know that saving them on private land is critical to the survival of whole genera. However, that legislation from 1934 does not apply to the landowner, and should you breach it, no one will catch you, and even if they did, the fine is £30. That's an extreme example, but it is nevertheless still active legislation. And then you have the under-resourcing of the agencies in charge. So you give agencies a very big job and you give them very little resources, and it's probably not rocket science to find that the outcomes that you want don't happen. So this is all very depressing so far, but it does get better. The upshot of all of that is that law and policy protects quite a lot less than it should, often very little, and usually at great expense. Law and policy is expensive to make. The average district plan would be $1.2 million just in agency charges. Some of the large regional planning processes can be in the tens of millions of dollars. But what generally happens when they fail is that a few prosper and the public interest in nature bears the cost. People get a bit pissed off with agencies and nobody's very happy except those that are making the money. It's all very predictable. I've talked about it ad nauseum in my career so far through various publications. But the question is it inevitable? I don't think it is. So my crazy and ambitious idea is that we make policy that we have any intention of implementing. And to do that, I think we need to do two things. We need to address the underlying drivers for why people behave the way they do, because policy is about behaviour change. So you can't put in a very strong protection legislation on top of something where the only economically sensible thing to do is to destroy nature. There is no economic disincentives in your way. There's a lax enforcement regime. So really, when push comes to shove, it's the most logical thing to do. Protection legislation, and you can see from the Wildlife Act, doesn't mean much in that context where the economic drivers are so powerful. And the second thing we need to do is turn our mind to an implementation realities of legislation. And some of the ways we might do that are we need to align interests and not opinions. So I think the collaborative processes are pretty popular in New Zealand right now and have been for about 10 or 15 years. And they're processes where you get a bunch of quite disparate interests in a room wanting to address what they call a wicked problem, a problem that's so multi-dimensional and so complex that it's not simply a matter of a straightforward policy fix. It's going to contest some people's perceived and natural property rights to such an extent that you really have to get them in a room. My view is we spend a lot of time trying to change the minds of people in those processes, and they help to set the environmental limits. My view is we need to change the reasons why people act. So it doesn't really matter why they're doing it, but we need to give them all a reason to do the right thing. And that is where you come to things like economic instruments. One of the most effective policy changes in New Zealand's environmental history was the removal of subsidies on wetland clearing in the 1980s. It virtually stopped large-scale wetland clearing overnight. Subsidies stopped, behaviour changed because economic drivers changed. And I think sometimes we put a lot of policy out there that is inordinately naive because the money just doesn't back acting that way. On the subject of money, we need to figure out who's paying from the start. With the benefit of 2020 hindsight, you think giving regional councils and their agriculturally dominated states sole responsibility to protect a freshwater ecosystem on private land with almost no funding, and what funding there was dependent on drawing it from the constituencies they were representing, it wouldn't be rocket science to say that probably wasn't the most logical funding model, and it's probably not surprising that it didn't work out. And another area, I think we need to work on measurable goals to track progress. So we need to know that policy is failing. We need to know that we're tracking close to ecological limits. And at the moment, we have a relatively incoherent program of environmental reporting. Although it is improving, particularly at a national and a regional level, we've got a lot of ways to go before we can actually look at a report and say, yep, I think we're doing what we intended to do. So a future of effective law and policy, which is my crazy ambition, is that we need a robust scientific basis as far as possible, which is where a lot of you come in. We need instruments that address those underlying drivers. We need to recognise that if all of the economic drivers stack up to behave in a certain way, then policy is unlikely to contest that on its own. I think for that reason we need a combination of regulatory and economic approaches to get some of the changes we need. We need a critical examination at the outset of where costs and benefits lie, instead of just assuming that everyone's just going to bear the opportunity cost and the clean-up cost and not going to say anything about it. We need to focus on the how of implementation. We need to recognise that a lot of the instruments that we have in place at the moment just simply don't work in practice, and we need to take steps to change those. Population management plans under the Marine Mammals Protection Act are probably a very good example of a tool that just doesn't work. And coherently track those policy outcomes so that we know when failure is occurring. That's it from me. Thanks. One. James.
Maree, in the policymakers or the government at the time or whoever is in a position of power to change this, where do you think the balance of apathy versus willful negligence to actually do what seems a rather straightforward set of stepping up actions lies?
Yeah, well, good point. The reality is that the vested interests in extracting from the environment are very much louder and more organised than the public, although in the general public, the public I'm talking about public interest in nature and however that might be represented in the policy space. So when you have a small, organised, highly motivated group of people and you have a largely apathetic remainder of the constituency, you get a predictable outcome. So I think to that extent you have two ways of doing it. You need to align interests and not opinions, so change the economic drivers so that it doesn't matter why they're doing it, it just matters that they do. And the second is you need to engage the public and make that opposing voice very much louder and more effective. So that's the two ways to do it. The first one is about the urgent issues. So I think for a lot of our environmental issues, they are urgent. We don't have 10 or 20 years for generational change of views. We have to act, so we have to use economics to our advantage in environmental policy very much more. And the second thing is we need to engage over time the public in those solutions and raise their expectations of agencies and proponents of development.